Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the start of our September Community Chat series. My name is Becks Heyhoe, and I am the Director of United to End Homelessness for Orange County United Way. And we have really found great value in bringing in local experts on homelessness into this series to update our community on what's been happening. In our previous sessions, we've looked really specifically at how COVID-19 has impacted homelessness here. But for this month's chat, we're going to talk about some slightly different things. And today, I'm really excited that we're going to be looking specifically around gender and domestic violence and how that intersects with homelessness. And just a quick kind of point of reference as I'm talking about this, we're going to be specifically looking at homelessness for women and for anybody who identifies as a woman, and how domestic violence has impacted women. But domestic violence is certainly something that knows no gender. But our topic today and our focus today is really going to be looking at women experiencing homelessness, what that has been like during COVID, how that's impacted the world of work for two incredible female leaders here in our community. So today I'm really excited to be joined by Brateil Aghasi, who is the Chief Executive Officer of WISEPlace, and Maricela Rios-Faust, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Human Options and is also a fellow board member here for the COC board in Orange County. So welcome to both of you. Very excited to have you join us. Maricela, we will just dive straight in. Could you just share with us about what's the relationship like between domestic violence and homelessness?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Bex, and thanks for having me on today to talk about this. So between domestic and homelessness, they're very interrelated. It's one of the intersections that we spend a lot of time in. What happens is many women who are fleeing abusive relationships, their number one fear next to safety is becoming homeless. Oftentimes they're needing to leave quickly, may not have financial means to be able to get their own apartment, have some issues in terms of landlord. Maybe they have some failed credit as a result of the abuse. They may have instances in which they lack access to finances. Maybe they weren't working because the abusive partner kept them from working. And so they don't really have the means to enter into an apartment on their own. Often when they do flee the abusive relationship, they end up in the emergency shelter. And the emergency shelter is essentially, during that time, they are homeless. What we're finding right now, particularly during COVID, is that we have more individuals and families who are needing to stay in the emergency shelter longer, which actually prolongs homelessness for them, depending on whether they have the ability to move in with a family member or get on live on their own, depending on their credit history and resources that are available. That facilitates moving them out of homelessness into their own location. We also find that many, as a result of trauma resulting from the abuse, have difficulty when they do find employment, being able to work through those employment, accessing help. And so what we find is very necessary, particularly for victims of domestic violence, is ensuring that we have mobile advocacy available for them, have the ability to give them some resources that will help them navigate the system, but also going to them. So going to them, having financial resources, working through any credit history issues so that they can get back on their feet and rent homes again.
Thank you so much for that overview. It certainly is something that is obviously very connected. And I know that the cost study that we did with UCI found that the second highest reason why women became homeless was due to domestic violence here in our community.
Yeah,
Brateil, I would love, oh, sorry.
No,
go ahead, Maricela.
I think in California, 33% of homeless women are homeless as a result of domestic violence, right? So that's, actually I should say 33% of the homeless population are women who are homeless as a result of domestic violence.
Thank you for sharing that. It's, yeah, that's a third of women experiencing homelessness who've experienced, something incredibly traumatic. And, it really is great that your agency is here in our community to be able to assist those people who've experienced that. Brateil, I'd love to hear from your vantage point. What have you encountered? Why do women become homeless here in Orange County?
Hi, Bex. Thanks for having us. Just to add to what Maricela said, you know, the great thing is we have data, right? And if we have data, we can find solutions to end homelessness here in Orange County. So the cost study really identified the 3 reasons. So not symptoms, because a lot of times in our community, there's talk about symptoms, which are really related to myths, right? But there are 3 reasons in Orange County for people to experience homelessness. And I'll elaborate on the 3rd one because I think it's really tied to why women experience homelessness. So the first contributing factor is securing and retaining jobs with affordable wages for all the reasons that Maricela kind of brought up. That's the first and by far the most contributing factor for people experiencing homelessness in Orange County. And the second, as we talked about, is finding and retaining affordable housing. But I would just like to add a little layer to that to really illustrate why. And the cost study really illustrated that the median rent has increased by 24%, while unfortunately the income has decreased by 10%. So if your rent goes up 24% and your income is going down 10%, excuse me, then of course, that math doesn't make sense. And then the 3rd reason the cost study identified was family issues, and that could be a death in the family. But for women, that is where the experiencing domestic violence and surviving domestic violence falls in. So it's really domestic violence for women in Orange County is the 3rd contributing factor for experiencing homelessness in OC. And at WISEPlace last year, our data showed that almost 60% of the women that we served last year, so 60% of over 300 women were survivors of domestic violence, and that was the top contributing factor for experiencing homelessness.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. And for anybody who's not familiar with WISEPlace, Brateil, could you just give us a quick overview, because your organization is, both of your organizations are pretty unique. Could you just give a quick snapshot on WISEPlace?
Sure, I'd love to. So WISEPlace, we're a community of hope and housing. We serve unaccompanied women experiencing homelessness here in Orange County, right here in our backyard. We've been in the Santa Ana community since the 1920s, believe it or not. We serve every city in our county, and we pair housing solutions, so shelter and housing. And in the future, we'll create our first permanent supportive housing as well. So all types of shelter and housing solutions. And we pair them with a whole host of wraparound services, such as case management, clinical counseling. We provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacks, all the meals somebody needs. We have a big focus on physical health as well, with partnerships with medical providers. And then we have employment and financial literacy programs as well. So really kind of the whole host of wraparound services for somebody to reach their personal self-stability and end homelessness.
Thanks so much for that background, and that really was quite shocking to hear, that 60% of the people that you are able to assist have experienced domestic violence, and that paired with with Maricela, with the statistic that you shared of 1/3 of women experiencing homelessness, it's due to domestic violence. I would love for each of you to share a little about how homelessness. We know that homelessness is a traumatizing experience for anyone. But I would love to hear kind of from your points of view, how just that combination of homelessness and domestic violence, how does that kind of intersect for people?
Sure. So for WISEPlace, from our vantage point, we really do try to cultivate a culture of healing. Because for somebody who is a survivor of domestic violence, for somebody who's experiencing homelessness, imagine if that was happening to you, right? And I think what COVID shows is that really homelessness can happen to anybody, because if you lose your job, you lose your health care, and then things spiral. So, we start with the cultivation of hope, and I can't stress that, because you can have all the financial literacy programs, you can provide shelter, but really you're helping somebody believe in themselves again. You're you're walking alongside, a woman's journey to believe in herself and to believe that the future can be different for her and that she is truly deserving of a good, safe, and healthy life. And, some people are shocked when I share that when somebody enters our emergency shelter or our transitional shelter, because we operate both, that oftentimes the woman, after, she is able to take a shower and get something to eat, oftentimes the women will sleep for at least a day or two because it's the first time that they have felt safe enough to close their eyes and sleep, right? Because if you think of an unaccompanied woman, which is what we specialize at WISEPlace, you're a single woman and you're experiencing homelessness. You are not safe, right? And so when they are aligned and have the courage to come to WISEPlace or any other shelter, the women will often sleep because it's the first night that they've been able to sleep and have that safety. So, one of the first things that shelter does is provide safety so that there can be a cultivation of hope and healing. Then, what I would say is obviously the wraparound services, but you have to develop trust. And that's really where the service provider, our staff, is so incredible and supportive to walk alongside somebody who's experiencing trauma, because it really all does start with trust. And that can take a very long time to develop trust with a case manager, trust with a clinical counselor, to start to unpack the trauma that you have experienced and to try to work on things that you can control and heal and start to rebuild your life. And then just really quickly, I do want to share that, one of the largest populations of that is experiencing increased homelessness is individuals over the age of 62. And a very high percentage, almost half of our women are seniors and older populations. And so there is, a lot of trauma there as well. We will support many women who have led, to be what we would think a very comfortable life, to have worked for years and years, and then maybe a spouse dies, or as their income is not exactly increasing, it's decreasing, but they are unable to afford rent or their mortgage anymore. And so senior women are experiencing homelessness at kind of an alarming rate as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I know that nationally and kind of what we're seeing across the country is exactly what you're talking about, this rise in senior homelessness. And they talk about kind of a tsunami of seniors expected to fall into homelessness over the next 5 to 10 years. That's something that we'd like to do a community chat about in the future. So if that is of interest to our attendees, please let us know. So pop that in the chat box and let us know if that's a subject that you would like us to explore a bit further in detail using this forum. Maricela, I'll turn back to you for this question just around the trauma of that combination of domestic violence and homelessness, and would really value your insight into that.
Thanks, Becks. So at Human Options, we have what we call as a trauma-informed culture, where we're really trying to learn from each of the individuals that come into the program, whether they're coming in on their own or with their children. And what we find is oftentimes, because of being in this very heightened sense of awareness and really fearful state, that often it takes a while for them to unwind and get comfortable. What we find is trauma shows up very differently in a variety of different clients and a variety of different stakeholders. And so what we try and do is do our best to really understand what happened to them. So really having them tell us what happened to you. What was that experience like for you? If we're making connections, what we find is sometimes in giving too many resources at once, that overwhelms someone who is already in a traumatic situation. So we try and really go at the pace that that person is. In our emergency shelter at Human Options, one of the things that we've had to really balance is that safety is critical to all of the women and children that are coming into our shelter for obvious reasons, because the abuser is generally trying to find them, and we are making sure that we're holding a safe space for everybody. That being said, we also need to make sure that we're layering on a lot of choice for victims and survivors who are coming into the shelter, because that choice is what's going to help them heal from traumatic experiences. It's how we ask questions, how many questions we ask, whether we believe them. All those things begin to set the stage for actually kind of breaking down some of the stories that they've been told by the abuser. Often what I've heard really from clients is really the stories of, going somewhere, trying to access help. And this can be in the homeless continuum as well, right? Is they're going in, they're being asked questions, they're having to fill out multiple documents. And this is somebody who just left, right? They are just left, they're fearful, they're trying to tell their story, they're doing their best to keep their emotions in check. And now we hand them a bunch of forms, right? And so that is overwhelming. It's something that most will say, well, nobody listened to me. All they did was hand me a bunch of papers. Well, that's part of the trauma and part of the healing that has to happen, because one of the number one things they're being told is when you reach out, no one will help you, right? No one will believe you. I'm the only person that cares about you. And so as providers, when we do that, I think it's important to just pause and really connect with the emotion that's being felt and really kind of welcome them in and say, I'm so sorry this happened to you. What can I do to support you? And it's something that in most systems, we all have to collect information, but how we collect information can actually be very healing. It can be really listening, connecting, really engaging them. What we find is anxiety and depression are extremely high for both. If you can imagine, single women have anxiety and depression. Now you take somebody who's come in with their children, they're second guessing, is this the right choice? They don't have that moment to breathe and to think through. And so really giving them the space to actually take a breath and pause and connect with them, and actually supporting the kids in a different way helps them re-engage with their kids once they're ready to, and to really kind of hold a space for their children to heal as well as themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. It's been incredible to see how the world of trauma-informed care has really sort of impacted the homelessness system. And just thank you for sharing those simple insights in terms of filling out paperwork and how that could just be so overwhelming. And yes, that's a necessity that we all have to do in this world and in this work, but reminding us that there's a choice in how we do that, and that there's a way that that can be done as we're offering services to people that can be dignified and meeting people where they're at. That was really insightful. So we are going to switch gears a little bit to COVID-19. And we know that COVID has, impacted communities across the globe. And I would love to know what each of you are seeing in your respective organizations, just around how COVID has impacted your world of work and the people that you're working with.
Sure. So at Human Options, we've seen a couple of different things. When the pandemic first really hit its peak, I guess, and back in March, and things were shutting down, initially we were fearful. We were really fearful that people and individuals would not find the opportunity to reach out. And especially because when everybody's going home and there's nobody working, most people are working remotely, what we found is there was not the opportunity for many victims to reach out. The one respite that they would have was when the kids were at school, when the husband went to work, and now everybody at home really closed that window. We actually saw a spike in requests for legal advocacy services during the first few weeks, and that was really related to trying to understand and navigate shared custody with the abuser, particularly if a child was immunocompromised. What do I do? What if I don't trust that the abuser is going to handle things in a particular way, or my abuser has threatened, right, to expose the children if we share the children and things like that. And so really what we were finding is abusers were using this as an opportunity to threaten once more. We saw a spike in requests for parenting. What we have learned at Human Options is really what happens is when a victim, or particularly a woman, feels like, oh my gosh, I need to do something to control the children. I need to do, if the kids just kind of behaved, if I took a parenting class, if I just got them to do things the way he wanted, then I would not be abused. And so we were finding that happening very frequently, and had a huge request for parenting and a waiting list for that early on. And as things have opened up, and as women have made it through our doors, we've heard really some horrific cases of abuse where it was maybe, you know, I thought about leaving earlier, but nothing was open. So I wasn't really sure where to go. And so I stayed. I mean, we've heard increased cases of strangulation. And for those of you that aren't aware, strangulation is a very lethal symptom of abuse. And it's one that we would maybe hear in about 10 to 15% of the cases, but it had jumped over to about 60% of our cases that were coming into the emergency shelter were strangulation cases. Women and victims and survivors tend to minimize when strangulation is occurring. So the fact that they were sharing told us really, it was a clear indicator that the abuse is hiding so much that you can't really minimize the strangulation. And then we were also hearing very intense cases of being trapped in their homes and literal traps being set in someone's home so that they could not flee. Fortunately, there has been a huge amount of attention put on domestic violence, both through the media, local partners, and everybody's really taken an interest that we've been able to do an extensive amount of outreach and communication on how people can stay safe. And we, you know, have managed to still provide resources, but there's so many individuals that we know we still can't reach and that haven't found that safe opportunity to reach out. And so I would just say that if you know someone or if you suspect someone, is do what you can to reach out to them and connect with them and let them know that you're available and there to support them.
Thank you so much. And I know that your team sent us some resources. So I just want to make sure those resources are appearing in the chat box and they're appearing on Facebook so that if anybody does need help, they need advice, well, that contact information should be landing in the chat box or on Facebook any moment now. So thank you. For your insights and for all that you and your team are doing to help provide a safe place for people to go. Brateil, I'll turn to you. How's COVID-19 been kind of impacting your world at WISEPlace?
Similar to what Maricela shared, we've experienced the same things in terms of reporting of lethality increasing, and our calls to come to WISEPlace have increased by about 30% in the last 6 months. Some of the biggest things that we've learned at WISEPlace is when a survivor calls and reaches out, our ability to provide resources instantly had to really increase, right? So because that person is finding maybe the one opportunity where they are able to leave an abusive partner or home. And so to not be open, say on Saturdays, Sundays doesn't work, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things that we've learned at WISEPlace and really challenged ourselves to really be accessible. So at WISEPlace, we're open 24 hours, 7 days a week. Somebody literally could access a service at 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning if they needed to. So really, as a service provider, you know, we've really pushed ourselves to operate outside of what we would deem as normal business hours because we want to be accessible. When somebody has the courage and the strength to leave an abuser, we will be there 24/7. So that's one of the biggest things that I think COVID has really changed. I mean, that's always a value, but I think all service providers are seeing that. So when somebody calls, being able to react and welcome somebody into WISEPlace with open arms has been a really big need. The other thing that comes up for us as WISEPlace is that we have an allowance of domestic animals. And that really does become a barrier for somebody to come to a shelter. And so at WISEPlace, we do have an allowance of domestic animals. And so we will see many survivors of domestic violence come to WISEPlace because that we wouldn't ask them to say part with their dog. or cat, any domestic animal. And so it allows women to access shelter who maybe would stay on the streets because they wouldn't want to part with their animal or stay living in their car, which of course makes them extremely vulnerable. So I think, the allowance of domestic animals and kind of staying true to that and even expanding that as much as we can, adding veterinarian services so that a woman experiencing homelessness and domestic violence knows that WISEPlace is a place for her to heal and rebuild her life. I think those have been some of the kind of like biggest lessons learned in COVID, is that your response needs to be immediate, because you don't know when a woman experiencing domestic violence is able to reach out again. So this response needs to be immediate. And the allowance for domestic animals really allows women to come and receive services at a shelter.
Great, thank you so much. Just out of curiosity, is there a length of time on either of your emergency shelter programs that you have to kind of operate within?
So at Human Options, ours is typically 30 to 45 days. Fortunately, we do have the flexibility to keep women there longer if they need to stay longer. We also actually at Human Options have what we call a safety net program. So we have a relationship with local hotels to be able to have families in hotels should they need to be there, and then have a transitional housing program that we've been able to adapt some of our service delivery model to meet the needs if somebody needed to stay longer. So we actually did not do anything to rush individuals out during this time, wanted to be able to provide as much support as possible while still having the ability to serve additional women and children who needed to come in.
Similarly, at WISEPlace, the average length of stay in our emergency shelter is about 121 days, where we provide the shelter in our emergency shelter and all of the wraparound services that leads to a woman's homelessness ending and her transitioning into her own apartment. And then in our transitional shelter, it's normally about 9 months to a year in our transitional shelter, where we're able to kind of end homelessness and a woman is able to transition into her own apartment. So similarly as Human Options at WISEPlace, we have benchmarks, but of course, every person's experience is different, and some people will need more support and some people will need less, but those are the averages.
Thanks so much. And I've just seen the time. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So I will just pose our last question. Curious, has there been any kind of significant pivotal change or any strategic partnerships that either of you would like to mention before I bring us to a close?
Yeah, so I would say with Human Options, the biggest pivots have been really actively reaching out to clients and finding different ways to conduct outreach, because the partnerships that we had were really with law enforcement, healthcare practitioners, and schools. Obviously, they were really focused on the COVID crisis and needing to focus on that. So really having to readapt one of the things I think that we're most proud of is being able to strategically partner across the homeless continuum. And we have been able to do a deeper partnership with Brateil, and Brateil, I'm sure, could share a little bit more about what that partnership looks like.
Sure. Yeah, so similarly, strategic partnerships are such a must at all times, but how do we all use our limited resources for the best of the community? And so we actually reached out to Human Options and said, we both have increased need. How can we work better together? And so what we found is that any unaccompanied woman who was calling the Human Options hotline is now being referred to WISEPlace, and we're working together with our wraparound services, with our joint legal advocacy resources, so that Human Options could really focus and increase their occupancy for families and women with children experiencing domestic violence. And at WISEPlace, we could really continue to focus on unaccompanied women or some of the senior women. So it's been really great working together.
Thank you.
Making sure our resources are utilized wisely.
It's really wonderful to hear just the creativity and the way that you've each been able to be flexible to the situation that's happening to help make sure that some incredibly vulnerable people in our community have been able to be assisted. We are at 12:30, so that does bring us to the end of our chat. I know we could have talked for a lot longer. I do want to say thank you so much to everybody who sent in questions in advance. That's how we do these community chats. When you sign up and register for the event, you get the opportunity to pop in your question. And so we will be doing our next chat in 2 weeks' time. Really excited that we're going to be having speakers from the Family Solutions Collaborative and from Mercy House, who run the Family Care Center, which is an emergency shelter specific for families in our community. So please register, send us in your questions so we can help shape that chat. And thank you so much to our guest speakers today. It really was a pleasure to talk with you and to learn from you. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. We'll see you in about 2 weeks.